This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mātauranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr. Barb, and today we're talking about Groundbreakers. So it's a new exhibition that's coming up in the Dunedin Public Art Gallery from the 9th of November this year to 27th of April 2025. So it's a good long bracket there that you can go along and see it. It's a free gallery. It's a free exhibition from the Dunedin Public Art Gallery. And it's around Grace Joel, Frances Hodgkins and the new art of Ōtepoti. So it's a fantastic exhibition and I'm very excited to go and see it. And today in the studio we've got two of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery curators here. Lucy Hammonds.
Hammonds.
Oh, I knew I was going to get that wrong. And Lauren Gutsell. I've got that right. There you go. Thank you very much for coming along here to the studio today. And it's going to be fabulous. I'm so excited about this because I really don't know that much. I've never heard of Grace Joel, so I feel very amiss there. Of course, I've heard of Frances Hodgkins, which a lot of people in the audience will have heard of her, and maybe also Grace Joel, but may also not be that familiar with her artworks and also the context of the world that they were working in and the other artists that were around that time. And of course, both Frances Hodgkins and Grace Joel have got retirement homes in New Zealand named after them.
Oh yeah, they do. I hadn't actually thought about that, but yes, they do.
It's quite interesting. So I thought, as we usually start these podcasts off with, or the show off with, just a bit of a background of yourselves, and then we'll move back into that to the exhibition there. So Lucy and Lauren here both are curators at the Dunedin Public Art Gallery with an emphasis on collaborative curatorial practice. Your artwork extends across contemporary and historic art and craft with both a national and international focus. And you're talking today about the upcoming exhibition, The Groundbreakers, which opens a window into the world of contemporary art in Ōtepoti at the turn of the century, and in particular women artists' experiences within this. So that's going to be very amazing. So Lucy, you actually did Unitec School of Design in Auckland and then shifted for your bachelor, majoring in critical studies and also a level 7 PG diploma in te reo Māori. So that's fantastic, right? And I imagine that having a little bit of te reo is actually really useful in your role there.
Yeah, kia ora, Barb. Yes, absolutely. That sort of was part of the entry into that sort of line of study, but you know, as it always does, you sort of end up in it for different reasons as well. But yes, I started my journey towards being a curator, like many people do, going to art school at the end of high school, thinking about what the creative world might deliver to me. And quite soon after, I think in my foundation year, I sort of became quite clear to me that I found it much more exciting writing essays about other people's work.
Right. Oh, that's an interesting transition though, isn't it? And nice to get that bit of clarity early on.
Yeah. So it was a sort of the critical studies program at Unitec at that time, which sort of doesn't exist anymore. It's quite hard to access specific curatorial education in Aotearoa. But that critical studies program was a really interesting and quite an innovative program at the time that kind of meshed together art history, exhibition making, and sort of critical thinking about art and culture in an expanded field of design and what we might call the sort of fine arts. So that was sort of one of the specialties of Unitec at that time, was that it was an art school that kind of equally privileged applied art practices like ceramics and jewellery, sculpture, and then, crossed sculpture, painting, photography, and then design disciplines like furniture and product design and graphic design. So it was a very kind of expansive context in which to kind of be able to think about what it meant to sort of think and engage critically with what those developing practices were. So it's not a necessarily conventional route to being a curator, but then there isn't really a conventional route to being a curator.
Yeah.
It's in itself kind of a pretty small field of practice in
Yeah,
this
I
country.
imagine it. There's few spots for it, but
Yeah.
it's very interesting that it's a different thing thinking about other artists and thinking about artists in general and the sort of critically around the context and the background and how they're intersecting with culture
Yeah.
than it is to actually making art. I mean, you can see there's obviously overlaps, and artists are always thinking about, not always, but they're thinking about culture and society and that as well, but not necessarily, it's sort of an emphasis from a different road, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think and there's differences in curatorial practice in terms of in a gallery context versus in a museum context as well.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you sort of start to see those things. You know, there's a part of our work that is about archiving. There's part of our work that is understanding the context implications and reasons for collecting. There's part of our practice that thinks about art as a space for knowledge production.
What do you mean by knowledge production?
Well, artists, we talk often about artists as people that turn ideas into form.
Right.
So, I consider artists to be producers of new knowledge. I consider artists' practices to be research-driven. And I think what we do is to some extent, is to facilitate and platform that and provide a space for those ideas to kind of come into contact with audiences. So, those are all the sorts of prongs of what we think about when we're making exhibitions and what we're engaged with and work as curators in an art gallery, which, has intersections with other sort of areas of curatorial practice.
You're almost like a composer for the symphony of all the arts there. Like, you're the person who's sort of,
There's elements to it. It's a very kind of diffuse and sort of diverse set of elements that we are playing with.
Yeah, including kind of organisational and a lot of written skills for and designing and public outreach, as well as the actual art there. Mm-hmm. Wow. Now I'm going to just move on to a brief introduction there to Lauren. So you actually did your BA in art history here at Otago University, and then went on to do an honours degree in art history also at the Otago University, and then a Masters of Arts curatorialship at the University of Melbourne. What made you go to Australia?
I went to Australia because that's where I could do that master's program.
Right.
At the time, I went through Otago University through the art history department back when that was available to students at Otago University.
There actually isn't art history anymore, is there?
No, not in the way that it existed when I went through the university. And I think at that time there were far less, now there are different opportunities in different postgraduate programs around curatorial programs and museum studies and things like that. But at the stage that this is quite a while ago that I was doing my master's, and Melbourne was sort of the place to go if you wanted to sort of focus on curatorial practice within a master's program. And yeah, I was very lucky to get in. I was really thrilled, and I think you sort of acknowledge, I always feel like we operate as curators in a space of, it's an immense privilege. You're sort of aware of the stories you're carrying, and the, art history is shaped by those that are engaging with it at different points in time, who are writing about artists, who are working with artists.
That's true, isn't it? History is told by the winners, but art history is told...
No, sorry. History's not told by the winners, not all the time. And I think Vic used to have a very good creative program, because I know some of the history students I went through, that one of them went off to do a master's in curatorship at Vic, 20 years ago or something.
Yes, it was one of the only options.
Yeah.
So I think you're sort of aware of the sort of privileged space that you operate in, and so that was kind of my journey from there. It was volunteering and internships and things like that. And
wow. And then eventually came back to Dunedin here.
Came back to Dunedin.
So we're very, very lucky to have you both here.
It's great to be here.
It's fantastic.
It's one of the best cities to be working in the field that we're working in, because of the wealth of institutions in a relatively small city, but also a city that understands, I think, and privileges and values heritage and is interested in innovation, is sort of big enough and small enough to be flexible and dynamic, is internationally engaged. And we've got an audience that's internationally engaged. So, we've got...
Because we have the Dunedin School of Art here, which is very old, established...
1870.
So they're one of the very first thing. That's 1 year after the University of Otago was established. So that's very early on. And of course we've got the Dunedin Public Art Gallery, but we've also got Te Hura has works of art there, and Toitu as well.
Yes, does Toitu and the Hocken.
And the Hocken, of course, yes.
Yeah, and that.
So it's all that early monetary wealth, as much as cultural wealth that's kind of enabled that, perhaps, in one place.
Yeah. And a lot of very famous artists also coming from Dunedin as well.
Yeah, and that was kind of the genesis and the thinking around this exhibition, Groundbreakers, that we're sort of coming in to talk about, because, it's a story that's been told many times in many different ways. The story of Frances Hodgkins, her early career, William Matthew Hodgkins, her father, and his contribution to building cultural institutions, and many other people who were involved with that. And I guess one of the things that we started to think about was, one of the things you sort of see when you're dealing with historical material is that people and audiences can sort of slip into I'm interested in contemporary art, I'm not so interested in historical art. So, you have a bit of slippage, or a bit of division, or kind of binary thinking about the subject. But what we started talking about, and it was what led us into the title actually, Groundbreakers, the New Art of Ōtepoti. It's an exhibition about the 1880s.
Right.
It wasn't a trick, but it was a reminder, I suppose, that at that time, so 1880, 1890, we've had an art school, the first major art school in Aotearoa, public art school, has been running for a decade. When you start to research that art school, you realise how many students they were teaching, because they weren't just a tertiary art school like we would think of now. They were delivering to all of the secondary schools in the region. They had massive cohorts, and they were also offering classes to both women and men.
Right. Which at the time, I guess, was quite unusual, was it?
Well, I guess it's building up for audiences a sense of Ōtepoti as a progressive and innovative city with this base desire to educate. So we've got a kind of combination of, wealth, a sort of cohort of new migrants who believe in educating
They
women.
believe in educating women. That's why
Educating
some
women.
of those very
Solid
early
Scottish background coming in.
Yeah. So we and then an art school, which was training teachers as well as training artists. Enough money in the community for artists to be selling work, and these desires to have this sort of grown up cosmopolitan context that was as good as anywhere else in the world. So there was a sort of real coming together at that sort of moment at the end of the 19th century, where this was, when we talk about it in the show, a progressive, exciting space for contemporary art. And that's a really good thing to remind people, is that what looks historical, maybe conservative, not what, something other than contemporary right now, was just as bold and just as controversial and just as sort of dynamic as those things in our particular context.
Yeah, interesting.
It's quite interesting. Like the term art history makes people think it's old, but it's like art captures history. It's kind of more like history in art, perhaps as much as
or a series of contemporary art just at different times.
Exactly.
We're often sort of reminding people just gently that everything in its time was contemporary.
Yeah.
And so you sort of have the benefit of being at this point looking back, but it's the works that were being made around this period. It was as Lucy said, it was a really progressive time with a lot of immense change, and that kind of focus of this show spills into the early 20th century and how that kind of expands into these art practices that then have these international careers outside of Ōtepoti. So it's sort of the exhibition will take you on this sort of like full journey sort of around that time and the impacts of that in the next stages of artists' careers.
And I guess at the time, because Dunedin was such a big city for New Zealand, it was the city. It was, it was the biggest city in New Zealand at the time, with the gold rush and everything in it. And you can see that through the buildings that we still have. The railway stations and the university itself that date back to that time. That they were really thinking this is a big town. We're building buildings here that are going to last forever. We're making something that's solid and big. And the connections back to Britain and Europe must have, in a way, been, yes, long distance, but also very close because people had immediate family back there. They were going back and they were, thinking, okay, I'm going there, for a tour around or whatever, or spending, a substantial amount of time if they did go back because it was such a long time to get back. So they were, in a way, more long distance, but in a way tighter connections still with the kind of cultural, like that European cultural.
Yeah. Well, what we're essentially looking at in terms of a moment in art history in Aotearoa with these artists, and it was something that we sort of started to talk about quite a lot when we were researching individual people, because it's not just an exhibition of Frances Hodgkins and Grace Joel. It's Frances Hodgkins and Grace Joel as two, I suppose, independent women artists who made a commitment to a professional life as an artist, both of which that story began here and both of which that story ends overseas.
Right.
So it sort of looks at this parallel path that they followed, but in the context of things like the Otago Art Society and the art school and that sort of matrix or sort of interconnected network of artists that were coming out of what the city offered at that particular moment in time. But what we became quite aware of is that very soon when you start looking at that group, you realise that this is the first generation of New Zealand-born artists.
Yeah, it's
really.
Interesting. Yeah.
In
a European.
Absolutely. In terms of migrant Western European art practices, because as you know, and we talk about in the show, the sort of idea of painting the landscape was an art tradition that came with European migrants to this country, and that's sort of where this type of practice starts is in painting the landscape, thinking about picturesque sort of histories and what is brought with and what sort of comes out of experience of being here. But what became apparent was that that this is a generation, a first generation of migrants, children. Or the children of first generation European migrants, I should say.
So the first generation
born
here.
New Zealand born.
Was there much of an influence from Indigenous Maori toy art there? That can you see any of that influence on the art of likes of that first European generation? Frances Hodgkins was there.
I think from an art point of view, in terms of art making or symbolism or processes, I wouldn't say greatly. What you get is illustrations of people's experiences of place, encounters between Māori and Pākehā. That was certainly something that was prevalent in Frances Hodgkins' early works. And in terms of the landscape, what you see is this is a transitional time in thinking about landscape traditions or landscape painting in Aotearoa, because you kind of see a change from, some of the first Western artists that arrived here were surveyors.
Right.
And so you have a sort of impulse of surveying, of selling back to Britain and more widely in Europe a picture of what this place might be and its potentials for people to come.
So they're thinking of it, this is the potential of the New Zealand landscape for agriculture and for that European style of wanting to get migrants to come here.
Yes,
and I guess also surveyors have a different way of drawing, like very kind of focused on the landforms.
Yeah. Which is not what we're looking at in this exhibition. What we're looking at is, I suppose, the first, another change in the way the landscape was approached, which was sort of bringing in kind of ideas of the romantic picturesque, and all of these are sort of common themes in terms of British and European art history. But what you do see is the integration of, say, harakeke or tikoko, or, flora and fauna.
So and I guess those Victorians and that where we're looking at sort of late 1800s, the Victorians were very interested in foreign flora and fauna. It was that great exhibition time. So if you're looking back at the English nobility, they were building terrariums and they were they were very keen on flora and fauna from far-flung places, which of course New Zealand was one of them. So having those native flora and fauna in the paintings.
But
it wasn't botanical illustration. It was just part of the landscape there, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what you see in the landscape. What we do in the exhibition is sort of look really at, artists working in that space, and then artists working in the space of sort of figure drawing. And actually that's probably where the exhibition starts to kind of hit its stride in terms of thinking about Grace Joel and Frances Hodgkins, because both those artists are artists that sort of give us an illustration of something other than the landscape tradition.
Right.
Whilst they both worked in the space of landscapes across their career, Grace Joel, there are less remaining works, but Frances Hodgkins certainly has a substantial kind of body of work around the landscape. But what we see in this early moment, which is what we're sort of focusing on, is something other than the landscape, is the body, and that's where you start to get into some interesting kind of nitty-gritty stuff about women's experiences, women artists' experiences.
So are all the artists in the exhibition, are they all women?
No, they're not all women. So the exhibition includes William Matthew Hodgkins. You can't sort of talk about this moment in time really without William Matthew Hodgkins.
So that's Frances
Hodgkins' father.
So he was actually an artist as well.
He was an artist. He was never a professional artist. He was sort of like an enthusiastic
was he very good?
Amateur. He was a good painter, but he was a lawyer by profession, or he came out here as a clerk.
Good to his subjective beauties in the eye of the beholder.
I don't know. I mean, it's expert opinion. If we were in a court, I think I would be allowed to ask that.
I think the power of William Matthew Hodgkins in this context actually is less so that he's got work in the exhibition, but those works are there. Really, the conversation around him is in his ability to facilitate opportunities for artists, for people to get together. He founded groups and societies, and was, principal founder of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery's collection. So he was a doer of things that brought people together who cared about art. They believed in the power of art, the importance for wanting this city to be a place.
And obviously very supportive.
Very supportive.
Without his support, we wouldn't have Frances Hodgkins.
No, well, I think that's something that comes through the show quite strongly as you move through. So the exhibition itself is, the experience of the show, as Lucy mentioned, is sort of broken into sections. So you come into the show through the landscape, through these sort of like intergenerational views and perspectives of the landscape, and different approaches to depicting that in this period of time, as different influences were sort of penetrating, I suppose, the community and the ways of thinking about depicting place as something that became not necessarily just a direct reflection of what you were looking at, or as something very powerful that, is a reflection of God, for example, which was, a tool of landscape painting at that time, to something that was far more sort of personal, being like personal experience in a particular place. And then that moves through into quite a focus on the figure. And representations of different human form and the complexities of that for different artists. And then the final part of the show really focuses quite specifically on Frances Hodgkins and Grace Joel, and sort of the point in which they're about to leave the city, who they both leave, within a year of each other.
Right.
Grace Joel returns once after she leaves, and Frances Hodgkins comes back twice. But beyond that, they spend the rest of their lives working in Britain and in Europe. And so I suppose it's important to, by having that conversation about Frances Hodgkins and Grace Joel, because like when you said at the beginning about how you had far more awareness of Frances Hodgkins' practice than Grace Joel, like that's actually one of the points of making this show, is that that's a common sort of position for a lot of people. And I think when you start unpacking their stories, they go on such a similar sort of path with their early careers, and yet Grace Joel is far less known for many people. And I think that was sort of one of the powers of the show, is to sort of address, because art history, as we know, it's full of different biases and imbalances. And so I think to be able to look at that sort of parallel emergence in this context, in this community, but look at how those paths sort of were similar and then diverged.
Do we know why they left Dunedin?
I think they were both seeking. I mean, they were both very committed to, they were both raised in households that believed in the power of education.
Yeah.
Frances Hodgkins actually was, I think, it would have been hoped that she was the musician in the family, and her sister Isabel would have been the artist, and Isabel Field is an artist. She's in this exhibition as well.
That's Frances Hodgkins' sister.
Yeah, sister.
Yes.
But obviously married, so has a different name.
Married with a different name.
Yeah.
And so they both, Frances and Grace, both received, and were supported in education. And I think they were also, and I think there's lots of differences between the two. Like Grace Joel was sort of supported financially in pursuing an art practice. She didn't have the same pressures, I suppose, of selling work that Frances Hodgkins faced at different points in her career.
And that's just because of personal finances.
Personal finances.
She had a private income.
She had a private, Grace Joel had a private income. But
so
I think
being rich it's actually quite liberating, because you can.
I suppose it creates different opportunities.
I think. But it's interesting because then, in the end, Frances Hodgkins is more well known.
Yeah, I think the thing to understand with the two, though, is that Grace Joel died in 1924, didn't she?
Yeah.
They were born not far apart. They were quite similar in age. Grace Joel was a little older, but not a lot. Frances Hodgkins had quite a long, late career. And Frances Hodgkins really hits her, because what we're looking at is a sort of late Impressionist period. We're looking at a period of art formally where these two artists are picking up on new ideas, new ways of painting, new ways of looking at the world that was a radical change from what came before.
Yeah.
But what Frances Hodgkins then did was really push that forward into modernism and into a new kind of set of innovations, which Grace Joel's career formally, subject matter-wise, what her paintings look like is very different. So that we're not sort of setting out to say there are two artists that are the same or have equal-sized practices or anything like that, and one is known more and one is known less. What we're saying is that there are two artists formed from and conditioned by the same experiences and contexts, albeit with different kind of life journeys. And what can we kind of learn from that?
Yeah, and I think something that's sort of interesting as you go through the exhibition is you sort of realise that it's, I suppose, easy to sit in our position today, and where Frances Hodgkins is recognised as an incredibly important artist in this country, but in Britain especially. But that is a relatively recent thing in our art history. It isn't, Frances Hodgkins didn't go through a career where she was celebrated in the way that she is now. Like even, as recently as the sort of 60s and 70s, there was still a lot of, you read reviews of shows from then, and it is not the same as it's sort of talked about now. And I suppose Frances Hodgkins' practice, if you compare the two, has been the benefit of recent major commitment from art historians.
Right.
And there's a lot of work. Frances Hodgkins is incredibly collected in public and private collections globally. Grace Joel, from the point in which she leaves Aotearoa, it's very hard to trace. There's very few works in existence that we know of, not to say there are not, but that we know of. And I suppose the people that have... it becomes quite evident that Grace Joel's art history and biography has been traced quite heavily through fragmentary, mentions in other people's letters. She comes up actually in conversation in Frances Hodgkins' letters that have been very well collected.
Did they correspond?
They definitely knew each other, but
yes.
I don't know that they
collaborated.
They definitely didn't collaborate, and there's no great evidence that they were friends with one another.
Right.
But they definitely attended the same. They were in the same circle. They exhibited both with the Otago Society of Art. They belonged to the same groups.
And I imagine,
it was a small city.
It's
a small city now, and it was a small city then.
Exactly. Everybody knows everybody now.
Yeah.
So, and imagine in a circle like art, they would have known of each other and known each other's works. What sort of works were they doing? Landscape figures, but were they doing watercolours? What were they doing there?
An interesting place to talk, probably, because I'm looking at the clock. How are we going to get through an hour? But we're going to get through an hour very well. But an interesting thing to talk about in relation to this show and the moment, I think, is to talk about the nude,
right,
and women's relationship and access to life drawing,
right,
and the differences between the two artists. And Lauren knows more about it than I do, so I'm going to bounce straight to her. But one of the really exciting paintings in the exhibition, which has been exhibited in Ōtepoti before, but is not very often exhibited here because it's collected, it lives in a collection in Melbourne,
right.
Is a really major female nude by Grace Joel from 1893.
And that's the one that's on your exhibition.
Free poster.
That's right. So if you go to this exhibition over the summer, and again that's on from the 9th of November right through until the 27th of April, so you've got lots of time, and I imagine there's limited numbers of those posters, is there?
Yeah, well, you've got to get in.
You've got to get in fast. And I was just hearing before that unbelievably this poster, it's double-sided, am I right? So it's got a famous Grace Joel, the nude, with the sort of, it's a kind of a looking at the back of someone.
I know. Well, it's funny when you talk about the controversy of the nude, and then you look at the work and realise it's a female's back from shoulder to waist.
So it's a very non-risque nude. You can sort of say that.
But in 1911, women still couldn't walk in the main streets in Berlin unchaperoned. So you've got to put it in context.
We're talking about very long dresses here, still dresses that go right to the ground, even if you're walking through mud.
And on the other side is Summer, which is
the Frances Hodgkins one.
Hodgkins.
Yeah, and it's lovely. They're both figures, both lovely. The Frances Hodgkins one's very kind of.
Yeah, it's developing a different sort of technique, and it's from a slightly later period. The Grace Joel painting is important for a number of reasons. One of the significant things about Grace in her life and what she sort of what became apparent through the research, and there's a couple of really excellent historical articles about her and a very good master's thesis in Canterbury University. That sort of pieces things together, because there aren't diaries and there aren't letters and there aren't correspondence. So one of the interesting things, and you talked about travel before and connectedness, was it became very clear how important Melbourne was to Ōtepoti Dunedin at that time in the art community. So one of the things that stands out about Grace Joel's story is that as an 18-year-old, I think, she left here and went to art school in Melbourne.
Just like you, Lauren.
Just like Lauren.
So what, in 100 years' time, there'll be a podcast about you,
Yeah. And again, I think that Melbourne, Sydney and Dunedin would have been really very closely connected at the time, with shipping being the main thing and people going, like stopping there and going back, and everything would have been coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's so many points of interest to want to talk about, but I think the interesting thing is that Grace Joel was sort of active in spaces that advocated and prioritised the figure as subject matter in art. So she, as Lucy said, she was at the Melbourne's National Gallery School. She was there at 2 points in time. So she started off in the School of Design in the late 1880s. And then returned in 1891 and went into the School of Painting. And her lecturers at that time, they were artists that were involved in the Heidelberg School movement, which is also known as Australian Impressionism. And And
Why is it called the Heidelberg?
Oh, it's to do with some camps that artists' camps that the artists sort of connected around.
Oh, the
painting
place
outside.
that they went to. All right, sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt there. I just was very...
No. But one of her other lecturers was Lindsay Bernard Hall, and he was a huge I guess actually both of them sort of emphasised the importance of studying from the nude. And this was at a point in time. So in Australia, by 1885, women art students could access a nude model at that point, whereas in a lot of places it was still the model had to be clothed or draped or something for women artists to be looking at that as subject matter for their works. And then by 1901, Grace Joel was in Paris, and she was a student of the Académie Julienne, and that was interesting because when you read about that academy in relation to the practices of male artists, it often gets written about as this very conservative space. But then it was an art academy that was founded sort of on the belief to sort of challenge convention, and it prioritised the figure and figure painting. And it was one of the first art schools, it was actually the first art school in Paris that admitted women artists as students. They had to pay double the amount to go there.
Oh, wow. So what was the rationale behind paying double?
One of the things I read about that was it was based on the belief that they themselves would not be paying the fees, that they would have
a rich uncle,
a father, or a man in their life that would be paying the fees for them.
Oh, right.
Perhaps, but that's...
So they weren't a struggling artist.
Well, I guess it was sort of,
Strange.
But anyway, they paid double for the privilege, but then they were given the opportunity to study from living models.
Right.
And so, the work in the show in Groundbreakers, Grace Joel's Untitled Nude, won her a prize, the Ramsay Prize in Melbourne. She was the first woman artist to ever do so, to win that prize. And then she went in Paris, she won another award for painting. And so she started to build this sort of momentum of these sort of award-winning works looking to the figure. And
that must be quite confidence building as well, coming from the other side of the world.
Oh,
from
yes.
Dunedin.
I imagine so. And then I think it's interesting with Frances Hodgkins because you sort of see... Like in her early career, Frances Hodgkins was often, would bring the figure into the depictions of landscape as something populated and lived in by people. So that is sort of where she would bring the figure. But then you see through the show sort of the different ways in which, because they have a lot of parallel, Grace and Frances, they have a lot of parallel subject matter in the fact that they would often look to women and children, mothers and children as subject matter. They would look to working women as subject matter.
And is that different from the men of the time, or is that just a general thing, or is that an innovation?
I think it's definitely a genre.
Yeah, it's
people at work, working class people, market scenes. That's a genre I think that isn't specific to women.
Because that's sort of like totally different style. But that's what Vincent was doing in those like market scenes.
Yeah.
What if you go back to
prostitutes, and that's kind of the same sort of time.
We're in a huge change here, like from agriculture to industrial society. So these would be contemporary things to paint that would be different working situations.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of keep coming back to is when we're talking about the work is reminding people, I think, of the newness and the disruption of it. And so when you look, it's interesting looking at the different works in the exhibition because you sort of, I suppose, as your eye comes to understand what you're seeing, you can start to read, okay, there's a kind of a controlled approach to the landscape. It's quite literal. You can see, there's Forbury Road and there's the harbour mouth. And
it's a very literal translation of what's actually there.
And albeit with some sort of drama and flourishes, but once we get into the figure and into the 1890s, I suppose, and it sort of ties into what Lauren was talking about the influence of Australian Impressionism and, to an extent, European Impressionism. But really what that was a big disruption in painting because you get you get a big change from a tree looking like a tree to a face looking like a sort of a flurry of different coloured brush strokes. And one of the things that you start to see when you look at the response to that is is how affronted people were at the idea that a
like
face,
when you've got it finished, then bring it to us.
It might have soft edges and if you couple a sort of visible brush strokes and unnatural coloration with a flash of breast, then you're in like a whole new frontier of controversy.
To a point where, established places and people that I guess were the old school back then would just not consider it to be art.
Yeah, which I think is
which is common for new art coming through. Is
yes,
what's there is the established.
It's always it's the common kind of story of art is that of life really is that the new is unsettling.
Yeah.
And then as we kind of come up to speed with it, it ceases to be so, and the next new is unsettling. And I think that is probably the reason why both artists left Aotearoa, and they both left around about 1900 or just thereafter. And as we've said, lots isn't known. And actually other artists in the exhibition also left, and what you sort of then get is a sense of what's left? What's left in Dunedin? Oh, there was a whole new generation came in behind them who were doing their own radical things,
right.
And continue to do so. Dunedin.
So will that be an exhibition next year?
Well, Dunedin School of Art was sort of like the cradle of New Zealand modernist painting, and 2 or 3 generations on from this in the 30s, and there's sort of,
in a couple of sentences, could you describe what modernist painting is?
Well, this is the moment where McCann and Toss Wollaston and these people were at the art school in Dunedin, and then a generation after that, you've got Ralph Ōtepoti and in his cohort coming in to train as these radical educators. So the city is a history,
right,
and continues to have a history of artistic innovation. It's fascinating. But what's also fascinating is looking at this group in London and based in London. They start to visit the same places in Europe. They exhibit together in
so sort of an expat community.
Definitely an expat community. But Grace Joel falls into an expat Australian community, whereas
interesting, because she's got those Melbourne connections.
Whereas the others sit quite firmly in a New Zealand sort of community. And there's all sorts of fascinating things. Like Grace Joel lived in Chelsea, and on the same block as Sylvia Pankhurst.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right in the sort of thick of the emergence of women's suffrage.
Yeah.
And, there's so many things.
And I think that was sort of the time then as well. Like when you think about New Zealand getting the vote, but there was all that suffrage things going on there, and there was, even the clothing. Like if you go back to those 1870s, 1880s, that's when the walking skirts come in, and the bicycle, and, Victoria's on the throne, and she's got young children of sort of an age where they want to start playing tennis, and suddenly sport becomes available for some women, and those sorts of things become more accessible, and then that sort of seems like it's this whole kind of culture and society is also moving towards. I mean, obviously some places then stopped and went backwards, and not everything got all fixed, but it was kind of a very different age from 1810.
So why did they think, like placing the context that woman artists seeing nude woman would be so disruptive? We're going to go like
were all the nude models? Were they all women?
No, they were male and female nude models.
Right.
But. Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, now it seems like why would it be such a kind of controversial thing? But I suppose it's just very much sort of its time. I think there's lots of things around that.
I mean, I can sort of see why them thinking like women artists painting a male nude might be controversial. But painting a female life model, like a female, like you'd think that painting a male painting a nude female life model would be more controversial than a female painting a female.
And I think you couldn't. There was even, like if you were a woman artist in a school, there was also schools where those students couldn't look at the work of their other students if they depicted the nude. So it wasn't even just about looking at the body in their own work, but actually looking at the work that depicted the body.
Yeah.
Was also banned for women.
There's a great letter, isn't there?
Yeah,
because one of the blessings of Frances Hodgkins' research is that she was a lifetime letter writer, and there are many collated volumes of her letters, which are great. But there's a hilarious letter where she talks about there were a number of places where there was life drawing available in Ōtepoti around this time, largely for men, or depending on your family, but her father didn't let her and her sister go to life classes.
That's interesting, because he was generally quite supportive of them as artists, but he drew the line at them studying.
But he went to one with a number of other people in his drawing club, and then there's a letter where Frances sort of describes the wife of another artist, John Halliday Scott, who was also a doctor at medical school, and his wife sort of snuck them the father's pictures to have a look at. And it was, you've got a quote about it, don't you, in one of your labels?
In one of the labels,
yeah. But, it's just sort of this subterfuge to kind of get to see this material that was off limits.
Because it's a slide pie.
Yeah. It's quite strange, isn't it? Because you think, just the idea of looking at other people's work and seeing how other people have approached something or done something, or...
I guess you kind of can't underestimate the power of Victorian morality.
Yeah.
It's a social norm.
I wonder if there's a role, the church in there somewhere, about who can depict form in terms of how, bodies in general are displayed, how, iconism and all that kind of stuff.
A lot of the teaching was from models. Like when I say models, it's like casts of antiquities, so the types of bodies that were useful to draw from were, heavily muscled kind of Greco-Roman kind of god figures that were brought out as casts or busts and heads and shoulders.
So were women artists allowed to draw from nudes from casts, rather than the life model?
Yeah, those casts are often pretty well draped.
Well, some of them are and some of them are. I'm thinking of David as pretty undraped.
There's one in the museum in Athens that, it's very nice. Yes. And I don't know how they can sculpt such a living thing out of stone, but
it's funny, isn't it, though? Because the church has got there's a lot of nudes in the church before 1880. You think there's quite a lot of semi-nude, cherubs and...
Oh, cherubs, so they're not people.
Well, they sort of are, they're people-esque.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know.
Some level of angel or something.
I think that's a sort of whole... There's a lot of material around the subject, but probably not necessarily where we've got our deepest level of knowledge. But
a future show.
Yeah.
But I think the exhibition, we've really tried to layer in a lot of interesting pieces of history and moments in time and things for people to sort of consider. And Grace Joel was someone who continued to sort of, I think, advocate or speak to the importance of looking to the nude as subject matter in art, to the point where she left a scholarship to the National Gallery School, the Grace Joel Scholarship, which was
that's in
Melbourne.
In Melbourne, that's not here.
Specifically for artists working from the nude, depicting the nude.
Oh, interesting.
And that was given out every 3 years to a student. Didn't have to be a student of the National Gallery School, but had to be an approved school by the trustees that were in charge of managing the bequest. And that was first awarded in 1930. And so I suppose that just speaks to this sort of commitment to seeing the importance, of the figure, that she left that bequest, so with the hopes that I suppose that, after her death, that students that were looking to that could be sort of celebrated and supported in that way. So it's sort of been an interesting, I mean, these shows always, this exhibition, there's 51 works in the show and multiple artists, and
mostly female artists, with the exception of
there's a bit of a mix.
It's a mix, but we have tried to, I suppose what the exhibition highlights is that this point in time that we are talking about, there was this emergence of women artists.
Right.
And so we can sort of say, okay, we've got Frances Hodgkins, we've got Grace Joel, we've got Catherine Holmes and Annie White and Isabel Field and Jenny Wimpress. But alongside those, there's, we've got William Matthew Hodgkins and Alfred O'Keeffe and
a scattering of other
males.
Well, it's a story that's been told, and it's been told largely and more strongly through the male artists. And I guess what we're trying to say is actually, if you look at how it's shaken down across time, these two women were the ones that really had chops seriously as professional independent artists, both here and internationally. And the men surrounding them also were important, made beautiful work and made important contributions. But
the stars of the show are really...
really the serious lifelong commitment to practices were these two. And there are many others around them who equally were following these paths. Women often don't sustain long careers as painters in this generation because, Isabel Field's a great case in point because, you get married, your family commitments.
The sister of Frances Hodgkins.
Elevate and, your practice might be shorter, but we wanted to tell the story differently.
So you want to broaden the narrative to include...
It's not taking away from the ones we've already talked about, but it's like, actually, we need to give some time to these two women.
Because the more you add into the picture or the narrative, then the better understanding, the more breadth
the fuller everything is, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's an interesting, we hope that people also think a little bit about the realities of sustaining an art practice at that point in time, like what it meant for, like you think about the idea now of going, okay, I'm going to fly from here to London and then,
and it's a 6 week, 3 month
the reality
journey.
of they're doing that by ship. And then, like in 1912, Frances Hodgkins made a trip home and she brought a lot of work with her. And Summer is a great example of that body of work that came back with her in 1912 and was
so she brought her paintings back.
Yes, she brought her paintings back, and she, with the aim to sell them. And so she was, going from New Zealand to Australia by ship backwards and forwards in 1912 into 1913, having exhibitions around each country, selling work, and then returned.
Which is a lot of time out from actually painting.
Yeah. I think it's also when you think, because Frances Hodgkins in the show, every work of hers in the show is a watercolour. She was, it wasn't until 1915, 1915 is the first date of a Frances Hodgkins work made in oil paint.
Right.
And it wasn't till the 1930s that she started experimenting with gouache. And so, just all these little things that we hope people just enjoy reading about and learning some new things.
Yeah. And is there a book or a catalogue or something that goes with the exhibition?
Not this time.
Not this time.
So where could people learn more about these famous women?
There's lots and lots of resources about Frances Hodgkins. Grace Joel there's more limitations.
It does seem like it's time for I think you guys could get together and come up with a coffee table type book illustrated with, because there's quite a lot of interesting life history and life story to go behind there.
Oh, yeah.
I feel there's definitely a book in this exhibition here.
There's a book in everything we do, but that's part of the problem.
Hey, so let's just go over the facts of this exhibition again. So it's called Groundbreakers. It's Grace Joel, Frances Hodgkins and the New Art of Ōtepoti. It's the 9th of November this year, 2024, through to the 27th of April, 2025. So it's a good long couple of months that you've got to get along
all
and get
summer.
there.
You've got all summer to
all
come
summer.
in.
And it sounds like it's an absolutely fantastic exhibition to go along to a couple of times.
Yep.
And you're doing guided tours, is that right?
So we're opening the exhibition on Saturday the 9th of November with a floor talk by Lauren and I at 11 a.m.
What does a floor talk mean?
Like we're going to take people on a tour through the exhibition and give them a bit of an introduction about it. And then if you keep an eye on our website or sign up to our e-news, you can kind of see what the events program is over the course of the show. But
of course, we'll put a link to that on our episode description so you can see where that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there'll be kind of repeats of that floor tour through the time that the exhibition is there.
Yep, and we've got kind of other speakers coming in to talk about more specific, as you've sort of heard, there's untold directions you could kind of go from a research point of view, and we're lucky to have a city full of people with expertise in all sorts of little parts of that, so we'll be pulling people in to talk about the things that they know particularly about.
That sounds absolutely fantastic, very interesting, and I'm sure it's the sort of thing that you can go back to again and again and again, and of course the first time you go you get this amazing two-sided poster with Grace Joel on one side and the summer Frances Hodgkins on the other. Hey, thank you very much for coming along today. As you predicted, the time has just slipped away there. You've been listening to the OI podcast. If you liked this episode with Lucy Hammonds and Lauren Gutsell, we think you'll like Drama and Wellbeing in Schools with Kimberly Frid, Don't Eat the Pink Snow with Pam McKinley, and Mana Wahine with Professor Angela Wanhala. Although it's hard to pick just 3 episodes because we've got so many amazing artists that we've had on this show. Madison Kelly, Jenny Lee, Andrew Last, and Lissy and Rudy from Lissy Cole Designs. So do have a look through that back catalogue over the summer and get along to that exhibition. The 9th of November it's open, and it goes right through until the 27th of April. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on ORFM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by ORFM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.